Great to see so many faces in the room. We're at 2:30 now, and I can tell you this as an MEP, we've never started on time, but MEP Philip Lambert and his team has told me, do not get Irish and continue to overtalk, that we got to get started. But I'm conscious people might come in the room, so I might just, if you don't mind, give another moment or two for people to find their seats. Please, while some stuff is marked out here in terms of press and Parliament of the European, feel free to come down a little bit closer to us. I see some hesitant eye. I love when I ask those questions and everybody averts eye contact. It's always great. But please come close. If press and other MEPs come, we're all sitting in unison today, so we can find our spaces. But I might just, we're good to go. I'm getting the thumbs up. Great. Good afternoon to you all. Delighted to be joining you here for Beyond Growth. Great to see so many people in the audience for what is going to be what I hope you find a very worthwhile and inspiring conversation. Our focus on the panel today is the care economy. And we'll be discussing the gendered nature of caring and how to put care at the centre of a Beyond Growth economy. And I was really inspired myself as an EPP, but as a young person coming from Ireland, when we heard the President of the Commission, even herself, talk today about a sustainable economy is one where that is built on fairness and equality. And I think that really inspired me and what this conversation will be about. I'm going to go through the running order and then I'll share a few notes, but ultimately you will hear from each of our guests. And we've all agreed that I'm not to overtalk and our panelists will keep to time and we'll get really a lot of questions from the floor. Before I go through to flag the Slido app, a QR code will pop up, but we will be taking questions from the floor. So I just want to flag that from the get-go. But let me run through the order to introduce our esteemed panel. Joining us remotely is Dr. Ipek Ikkaracan. I hope I'm pronouncing her surname correctly. Professor of Economics at Istanbul Technical University in Turkey and President of the International Association for Feminist Economics. She will share herself. Unfortunately, she physically couldn't be here, but there's a little important election going on right now in Turkey, and I think we can all give her a pass to be there versus here in person, but she's going to join us remotely, followed by Dr. Tim Jackson, ecological economist, writer and professor at the director of the Centre of the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. So we'll hear from Tim. Following that, we will then hear from Mary Collins, Senior Policy and Advocacy Coordinator at the European Women's Lobby. Dr. Hans Dubois, Senior Research Manager in the Social Policies Unit at Eurofound, based in Dublin. As an Irish MEP, I promise I didn't coordinate a lot of Irish folks here, but it seems to be doing well right now. And then to conclude the panel, we have Dr. I'm really advocating for Ireland now, but to conclude the panel, we have Dr. Robert Sweeney, Head of Policy for think tank Action on Social Change Ireland. Dare I say, a bit biased, we're perhaps best in class. But that might be a bit tongue-in-cheek to say right now. I'm going to let you hear from them. We will then shift to what I hope will be an interactive audience Q&A session. Panelists will take questions from the floor and online through the Slido. So if you haven't taken shots of the QR code, please do so. We'll pop this up throughout, but just if we perhaps can have our administration done now to allow a speedy Q&A later on, that would be great. After the Q&A session, I will then turn to Laeticia, Thissen. She's nodding, so hopefully my pronunciation was okay there. Policy Analyst for Gender Equality at the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, or FEPS as it's known, and Dr. Meena Fernandes, who is Policy Analyst in the European Added Value Unit of the European Parliamentary Research Service, for their reaction to what has been shared. So it's a recap of everything coming from the floor and, of course, from our panels. And ultimately, I'd like to say both will be holding us accountable to the work that needs to happen next. So no pressure, ladies. But just for my own few words, across Europe and the world, The giving and receiving of care is a constant, and dare I say, is close to everyone's heart, in particular everyone in this room. Families and friends, formal carers, often volunteered carers, supporting and providing care around the clock to those who need it, who require it, who perhaps don't know how to ask for it either, is an important point to acknowledge. From children to persons with different abilities, or people with long-term illnesses, or our older generations, but ultimately all generations. Each and every one of us here today has been cared for at some point in our lives, and will more than likely be a carer for someone else too. And this is the foundation of our social contract through generations. Investment is care is not just a moral necessity, but it significantly contributes to a sense of belonging, and allows for the positive development of both those who are cared for and those who care. And I must say, that bit we're not doing very well in. And by we, I mean, as a policymaker, I take accountability here. The COVID-19 pandemic shone a light on the provision of care. We applauded our frontline workers battling the worst of the pandemic all day, every day. However, it became clear that the care sector has and continues to be underfunded and understaffed, both formal and informal settings. And I know we have a number of carers. I welcome Tracy, a carer from Ireland, and no doubt many other carers here in the room today who can also echo that. The pressures of caring on carers, families, volunteers have become so abundantly clear, and there is need for change, and we need to put care at the centre of a sustainable future economy. A social conversation on the future of care is now urgently required. I would have said that yesterday. I'd be saying that hopefully the urgency piece that we actually have action on this now versus waiting any longer. It's extremely gendered, the term care, the work of care, and women bear the brunt of care responsibilities often. And this plays a central role in the inequality between genders, or those who identify as other. 80% of all long-term care in Europe is provided by informal carers, overwhelmingly, again, women, who are deprived of fair working conditions, mostly unpaid and without adequate social or any form of support. And the EU Commission themselves has reported 90% of formal care workforce are women. And this feminisation of the care sector, in my eyes, impacts women's economic independence, contributes to pay and pension gaps, and can lead to an increased risk of poverty. And I can probably change that. It has led to an increased distance and risk of poverty. We are so desperately need to change the attitude towards care and move away from male breadwinner, female carer narrative, which continues to shape society's view of care. Our changing demographic patterns across the EU present challenges for the present and future of caring. With an ageing society living longer and varying health needs, a falling birth rate and the decline of working age population combined with lengthening of work life. And research in this shows that a number of persons in the EU in need of long-term care is projected to rise from 30.8 million people in 2019 to 38.1 million people in 2050. So there's a potential for up to 8 million vacancies in our health and social care sector in the next 10 years. So we have urgency here. We are already face labour shortages in the long-term care sector, and this risk is only increasing. And ultimately in this point, and I know from speaking to carers, it is family, friends, that volunteer-led initiative that is often the bearer brunt here in this. Just to acknowledge, and I know many of the panelists will pick up, but the European Parliament passed a report on common European action on care last July, and the European Commission launched its own EU care strategy last September. It demonstrates a momentum growing, but unfortunately, as we discussed, we might not see that achieved, particularly the EU care strategy this side of the mandate. Hopefully I'm wrong in that. But I also want to be realistic in sharing in this room in particular. The significance of this conference for us all, especially policymakers like myself, is to understand Creating any type of role in the care economy means creating low carbon jobs. Also, for a job to be low carbon, must be work that is non-extractive and vital for having a healthy and functioning society. And this is where I'd love to hear from not just the panelists, but you on the floor with expertise, lived experience, and this is where that interactive Q&A is so important. Care work ticks both of these boxes, which only further amplifies and underlines that a properly functioning care economy is essential for a sustainable developed one, I should say. Now, you've heard enough from me. I've broken the cardinal rule of keeping it tight and short, but I'm going to pass to our first speaker. Dr. Ipek Ikkaracan joins us first via video link. Ipek is a professor, as I mentioned, of economics based in Istanbul, and I'll pass it over to Ipek now. I've been told if we give a round of applause, it might work.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you for accommodating my remote participation. As MP Walsh has kindly noted, we had the first round of presidential and parliamentary elections in Turkey yesterday. And independent of the results, our struggle for an improved democracy and a more fair and sustainable economy in Turkey at the southeastern tip of Europe continues. So in my presentation today, I will use the concept of the purple economy, which I hope will establish a background, a framework for the preceding presentations. But before I describe what I mean by a purple economy, let me first look at a definition of what we mean by the care economy. Can I have the next slide, please? So the definition of the care economy, at a minimum, while there are discussions in feminist social science circles as to how we define the care economy, but at a minimum, it entails the production and consumption of goods and services necessary for the well-being of, first of all, care-dependent groups such as children, elderly, ill, disabled, as well as of healthy prime working age adults, including self-care, which allows them to function at, as Susan Himmelwhite names it, at a socially acceptable level of capability, comfort, and safety. There are different categorizations of care work. One of the categorizations that we are most familiar with is unpaid versus paid care work. The unpaid care work, most of it occurs in the household for production of care goods and services. And increasing availability of time use data actually enables us now to quantify it in terms of number of work hours per day. According to a recent estimation by the ILO, it's around 16.5 billion hours per day, the unpaid care work in the household, with 3/4 performed by women. In terms of an 8-hour-a-day shift, it corresponds to approximately 2 billion full-time jobs. So that in itself, the magnitude of it actually points to the potential for care work being turned into decent employment opportunities. The paid segment, which is in healthcare, social services, including long-term care, education, including early childcare and preschool education, domestic workers and personal services, almost 400 million workers around the globe, constituting 11.5% of global employment, and as a continuation of the gender division of labor within the household, but to a lesser degree now that it's paid, around 2/3 of this care workforce are women. Next slide, please. So the purple economy is a catchphrase capturing the vision of a gender egalitarian and caring economic order. It appeals to the popular concept of the green economy and uses purple, which is a symbolic color of women's movements in some countries, in fact, in many countries around the world, including where I'm based, Turkey. It resonates the emerging calls from a number of different initiatives for future visions of what the UK Women's Budget Group, for instance, calls the caring economy, what UN ECLAC at a recent regional Latin American conference in Argentina called the Care Society, and what a feminist political scientist from the US calls caring democracy. Purple economy, while it resonates with these calls, puts the emphasis on complementarities with the green economy and also points attention to trade-offs between policies that take us towards a more caring society, a more caring economy, and how they are not necessarily always taking us closer to gender equality. So when we look at the policy agenda, what we see is discussions around part-time, flexible, home-based, hybrid forms of employment, particularly for women, in order to allow women to reconcile unpaid and paid work, or extended maternity leave for mothers without any discussions on paternity leave, or cash for care transfers are among the policy menu. These policies have the entry point of reconciling unpaid work and paid work, but at the same time, by designating the space for that reconciliation only to women, they are not necessarily gender equal. So the entry point for the purple economy is a caring society, a caring economy with equal gender norms, where redistribution of care work from the private sphere of the household to the public sphere of public services, from unpaid to paid work, and also redistribution of unpaid work within the private sphere of household from men to women are emphasized in this framework. Next slide, please. This we call the 4 pillars of a purple economy. 3 of particularly relevant to the European case, where one is more, particularly the one on rural communities is more relevant to less developed rural settings. So the starting point is the construction of a universal social care services infrastructure, which is also the source of purple jobs, as we call them. And I will also note that care jobs, these purple jobs, care jobs, are also green jobs because necessarily they're local service jobs with low emissions and relatively low waste. The second entry point, and it is this first pillar that aims at the redistribution of unpaid work to paid work from the private to the public sphere. The second intervention entails labor market regulation for work-life balance, but with an emphasis on equal gender incentives. And it is the pillar that aims at the redistribution of unpaid care work within the private sphere from women to men through interventions such as care leave, paternity leave in particular, care insurance schemes, shorter working week, and decent jobs for care workers. The third pillar, which, as I said at the beginning, pertains more to less developed rural settings, countries with less developed rural settings, addresses the arduous care work that is entailed in food processing and food production, carrying water or firewood, which we see in particularly in regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa or in South Asia as making up the bulk of the unpaid care work. And here, investing in a social infrastructure is not sufficient. There's also need for investing in time-saving physical infrastructure. The final pillar, which I call enabling macroeconomic policies, is basically about providing the macroeconomic framework that makes the first 3 pillars possible. So here we are talking about proactive fiscal, monetary, and industrial sectoral policies, prioritizing investments in care, and particularly decent employment creation towards inclusive and sustainable growth. Next slide, please. The complementarities between green economy and purple economy, I think first start off in that they both account for what is invisible in mainstream economics, with the green economy pointing to the value of nature and the purple economy pointing to the value of unpaid care work. Green economy acknowledges that human well-being depends not only on consumption, but on access to sustainable ecosystems. In a parallel manner, purple economy emphasizes the importance of quality care systems for human well-being. The green economy have been, the policy interventions for a green economy have focused on internalization of environmental costs into production and consumption patterns. And in a similar manner, the 4 pillars of the purple economy is organized around internalization of the costs of caring labor into production and consumption patterns of the market. The green economy is a response to the environmental crisis and the sustainability of provisioning by nature. And in doing that, it also emphasizes how it provides also a response to the economic crisis for having the potential of generating green jobs. And in a similar manner, purple economy is a response to the crisis of care and simultaneously to the economic crisis through its potential to create employment through purple jobs. Next slide, please. The potential of the purple economy or investing in care in employment creation has a synergy with emerging macroeconomic policy proposals vis-a-vis deepening economic crisis and structural change, technological change, with the prospects of jobless growth, where the call from macroeconomists such as Joseph Stiglitz, who's I note one of the speakers, I think, on Wednesday at this conference, also through macroeconomic mainstayers such as UNCTAD, and also UN Secretary General, who are all pointing out to the need for fiscal and sectoral policies for full employment and inclusive growth. So in that sense, the call from feminist economics for investing in care in order to reduce the gender economic gaps overlaps and builds a synergy with these macroeconomic policy proposals for full employment. The recent policy simulations from different countries shows that care services sector have the highest employment multipliers. And this is predominantly due to the fact that particularly direct care, the provisioning of care services on a one-to-one basis from the caregiver to the care receiver, through its organic nature, is a kind of labor or labor process that persists, increasing productivity through technological change. So there is limited scope in that sense for replacing living labor with artificial intelligence or digitalization or other types of technological advances. So that 16 billion hours of unpaid care work within the household is a testimony to the labor-intensive nature of care work. Next slide, please. A recent simulation that we did for the ILO for their report called Care Work and Care Jobs for the Future of Decent Work, which was published in 2018, compared different scenarios of care investments. So our starting point was the baseline was 2015. And we compared 2 scenarios into 2030, which is the future vision for the Sustainable Development Goals. One scenario we called the status quo, and the other one, high road scenario. The status quo scenario assumed that the countries involved in the study, which were approximately 45 countries making up 85% of global GDP and employment, if they were to stay within the similar constant provisioning rates, even then, due to changing demographic composition, particularly with the increasing need for long-term care, there would be approximately 152 million new jobs added in the care sector and indirectly in other related sectors to the care sectors. The high road scenario simulated the case where these 45 countries making up the bulk of the global GDP and employment, if they are to increase their investments in the care sectors in line with multiple sustainable development goals, then the job creation would be an additional almost 120 million jobs, most of them in early childhood care and long-term care. So this was one of the increasing number of simulations around the world, starting in the 2010s, now into the 2020s, that shows that the care sectors have carried this enormous potential for supporting fiscal policies towards full employment. Next slide, please. The macroeconomic proposals, as I said, comes from the Nobel laureate economist Stiglitz, who points out the importance of proactive industrial, I'd like to call sectoral and fiscal policies, targeting labor-intensive industries such as education and health, and the potential they have to promote employment while simultaneously also reducing inequality and promoting macroeconomic stability. The UNCTAD Trade and Development Report from a few years ago puts the emphasis on government spending on social services, in particular in care activities, which in their current state are underprovided by the state in most countries, how they have the potential to generate much higher multiplier effects on employment. And all these efforts recently fed into UN Secretary General's report that came out in 21 called Our Common Agenda, which calls for 12 commitments from UN member nations. One of them is under gender equality, investing in care to facilitate women's economic inclusion. But the other one is on inclusive economies, where the report calls on investment in 3 sectors which have the greatest potential for creating more and better jobs. And these are the green sectors, the care or purple sectors, and the digital economies. This is a moment, I believe, that where we can actually use the synergy between the more progressive macroeconomic proposals and the call from advocates of gender equality to build the investing in care agenda into fiscal budgets and stimulus packages, which have a strong rationale for purple and green investments and jobs. I hope I didn't surpass my time too much.
Thank you very, very much, Ipek. I appreciate that. And thank you for connecting in. I believe you'll stay with us for the rest of the conversation, but very best of luck in those Turkey elections. Yeah. I'm going to quickly hand it over to Dr. Tim Jackson to take it from here. Before actually you share, I should have said at the start, I'm failing as a moderator at the outset. Translation is available in French and German. It's in the headsets right there. Number 1 for German and number 3 for French, I've been told. So just in case anybody needs French or German. Thank you. And Tim.
This session, for me, the care economy is more than just a side panel in the Beyond Growth debate. It's the blueprint for a post-growth economy. Let me try to explain why with a very simple question. What can prosperity possibly mean on a finite planet? That question's been the guide for our work at the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity for more than a decade. The conventional answer, of course, is that prosperity is about wealth, and in particular about accumulating wealth, about having more. And when you don't have enough to survive, when the harvest has failed again, the sanitation is non-existent, the house is falling down, the well has run dry or become polluted, then having more, having anything, makes a lot of sense. But what next? When do the fairy tales of eternal economic growth, as Greta Thunberg has called them, stop being a reliable formula for well-being and become a recipe for disaster? What is prosperity when the climate changes, nature reels, and human lives become cluttered and meaningless? When you ask people, as we did when I was Economics Commissioner at the UK Sustainable Development Commission, you find, fascinatingly, that health is what comes out at or near the top of most people's lists. Our own health, our family's health, the health of our communities, the health of our environment. What would happen if we thought of prosperity systematically as health rather than as wealth? Where health is conceived, as the World Health Organization has defined it, as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. What difference might that make? Well, perhaps first, in a place of always more, we might be tempted to think more deeply about the concept of enough, to return to what Aristotle described as the virtuous balance between deficiency and excess, where the word virtuous is meant here in the sense of virtuosity or skill or perfection as much as it is about moral virtue. Capitalism's fundamental conceit, one of its many conceits, is that in striving relentlessly for more, it has no way of knowing where enough might lie, and no way of knowing how to stop when it gets there. Take something relatively simple, really simple, something vital to human life, like breath. We don't survive without sufficient air, but we don't do well either by hyperventilating. It's entirely possible to breathe too much or too fast or too shallow. The connection between breath and life is complex and profound. It's about balance rather than more. There is no in-breath without the out-breath. A slow in-breath, followed by a long out-breath, with the air on the out-breath slightly compressed by the throat to stimulate the vagus nerve and induce what is called a parasympathetic state in animal bodies, leads to a calm and relaxed state of well-being. Try it, it's worth it. It contributes to prosperity. It contributes nothing to the GDP, but it makes you feel better. By contrast, the heady rush towards more and more, the relentless terror of status competition, the never-ending acquisitiveness of the consumer society stimulates the flight or fight response, a continued state of heightened anxiety. Or let's take nutrition. When you're forced to the food bank just to survive, as many care workers still are today, then having more is a no-brainer. But today, across the world, according to the WHO, more people die from diseases of overconsumption, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, than die of malnutrition. It's an extraordinary indictment of the profit maximization within fast food chains and the philosophy of more that legitimizes them. So what, you ask? What's all that got to do with the care economy? Well, first, it's clear that care is not just cure. It's not about selling more and more pharmaceuticals. It's not just the patient nursing to health of the sick, the bringing up of our children, the solace we can bring to the elderly, the infirm, the dying. It is all of those things, of course, but it is more. It's about the way we live our lives, how we organize our societies, how we run our economies. Care is something that can meaningfully be taken as a quality of the economy itself. At least it can when it is. In our economies, it isn't. The US political scientist Joan Tronto suggested something similar when she defined care as an activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, or repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. Maintain, continue, repair, nurture, nourish. Care, in its essence, is characterized by the need to pay attention to people, to things, and to the planet itself. Most obviously, the attention of one human being to another lies at what Nancy Folbray called the invisible heart of the economy. while Adam Smith's invisible hand is busy insisting that we are all self-interested producers and consumers, Folbray points out that without care we are nothing. Our societies are nothing. Our progress is nothing. Without care, there is no economy, not even at the most basic level. Care continually improves the quality of our lives. But more than that, it involves human beings, as Ipek pointed out, in the service of each other and of the material world. And so it has the potential to provide society with a never-ending source of employment. Even in the formal economy, as my figure shows, if you could put the slide up, Barry, the social and personal services sector, a sector where many care activities live, has the highest employment intensity in the economy. There's something else remarkable about this figure. The horizontal axis shows employment intensity, the vertical axis shows carbon intensity. The care sector has a considerably lower carbon footprint than the materialistic consumer economy that provides the foundation for modern economic growth. We're looking at what we might call an economic sweet spot, a place which offers a blueprint for a well-being economy, an economy that works for people and planet, an economy whose vision of progress is health, not wealth. There's just one problem with it, and it begins with another C, capitalism. Care is an anathema to capitalism. Its virtues are capitalism's vices. Its employment-rich foundation for well-being is capitalism's productivity crisis. To the mainstream economist, employment intensity translates directly into low or stagnant productivity growth, the very thing in that view that is holding us back from the economic growth we are so obsessed with. And things get worse. In the so-called social contract of neoclassical economics, wages follow productivity growth. So capitalism condemns care workers to pitiful wages, insecure jobs, impossible working conditions, and, pandemic aside, the lowest ranks in the status game played out in modern society, forgetting that without care, we are nothing. Of course, you don't need me to tell you that most of the people working in the care sector, paid and unpaid, are women. You don't need me to tell you that measuring productivity in monetary terms, as Commissioner von der Leyen reminded us this morning, measures everything in short except that which makes life worthwhile. Valuing only what can be produced and consumed at cost to the planet misses the foundation for life itself. You don't need me to tell you that the game of productivity is rigged. Rigged in favor of men, possibly. Rigged in favor of what the late Herman Daly called uneconomic growth, probably. Rigged in favor of those who profit from distress and ecological devastation, definitely. Which is why this session matters, not peripherally to the Beyond Growth conference, but as the living, beating heart of its concerns. The care of human life, and not its destruction, is the first and only task of government, wrote Thomas Jefferson at the beginning of the 19th century. And so our job in rescuing the care economy is not just to applaud the nurses from our doorsteps or support their strikes for decent pay. It's not just to rail against the patriarchal system, though that, of course, is one of the greatest joys of attending a session on the care economy. Our job is to reconceive economy as care, to equalize the horrendous health inequalities that condemn so many to unhappy, unhealthy lives, to build a concept of universal basic services, to protect the rights, wages, and living conditions of care workers, to reform the distorted productivity that robs care of meaning, to constrain the rent-seeking behavior of private firms intent on extracting value from people's infirmity, to reframe primary health care as a lifelong strategy of positive health. Our job is nothing less than to unravel the systematic distortions of value that lie at the core of a broken capitalism, and to begin to construct an economy of care, craft, and creativity fit for purpose on a finite planet. And, oh yes, to paraphrase the infinitely more eloquent Taylor Swift, to bring down the patriarchy.
It's always good when Tay gets quoted. Thank you very much, Tim. And I could see people frantically scribbling as you were sharing, so no doubt a lot of pickup of questions from your intervention will be following. May I pass to Mary Collins to share insights, and as mentioned, Senior Advocacy and Policy Coordinator at the European Women's Lobby. And if nobody has come across them before, please do so right after this, because when we talk about lobbyists doing their job well, transparency and driven, Mary knocks every time any sort of gender-specific file comes here in the Parliament. So she is doing her, as we say in Ireland, Oberweiler, her homework. So pass to Mary.
Thank you very much for that. And good afternoon, everybody. It's going to be very hard to follow Tim because I think he said it all. But I also want to start by saying congratulations. You've put care on the agenda, on the political agenda, where it has been missing for far, far too long. I'm also, thank you. Thank you. And I think we all agree that during the pandemic, it never became so visible of how we all depend on each other and how we all need each other. And yet we were all made invisible in terms of care. I'm also very happy that Ipek is with us too, because as part of the European Women's Lobby, we have a feminist economics working group. And we worked on developing and publishing what we call a Purple Pact. So I can say that Ipek is the mother of our purple economy, and I would invite you all to read it as well. As part of this feminist economic model, we can certainly say that no economic model, and that includes neoliberalism, can actually survive without care, as it was said, and therefore we can all agree that care is the backbone of society. But before I explain really our care deal, I'd just like us to be clear as well about what we're talking about. I mean, it has been put into a context, but I think sometimes the word care can also mean different things in different languages, and for some groups of people, it can have different connotations. So let us be clear. We are talking about our collective responsibility towards each other, whether we are recipients of care, givers of care, and while we are also caring for the planet. So we have a holistic approach that is based in a human rights framework. And I think that's really, really important to stress that we're talking about our shared humanity, basically, at the end of the day. And we have a duty towards each other, and under no circumstances can any form of exploitation be part of that. And we have the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, which could be used as a benchmark to ensure that we are on the right track. But the question is, who cares? And it has been said, is women. And women have taken their lion's share of care for decades, for centuries, and have been taken for granted. I think we have to acknowledge they have been taken for granted. And this must stop. We see the data, the statistics from the Gender Equality Index, for example, that's produced by the European Institute for Gender Equality on a yearly basis. And it shows year in, year out, that while men's share of care has increased, it still remains a woman's issue. And whether we're talking about formal care, informal care, all forms of different forms of care, we're talking about women. And this is at the core of a care deal for Europe. This is what we need to challenge, and in a beyond growth model, this has to be the driving seat. So we call for a structural approach. And what do we mean by that? We mean that care deal should be put at the same level as the Green Deal and, if you like, the digital deal or the digital agenda. It has been pointed out as well that both the Green economy and the digital economy are the drivers of the future. So care, we have to close that circle. There is a missing pillar, and that pillar is care. And particularly as we're moving towards an emission-free digital economy, we know that care is a sustainable economic model moving forward. That means that we need massive funding, and we have that at our disposal in the European Union through the EU Recovery and the Resilience Facility and the Next Generation EU package, because it is long-term, and we're talking about the next generation too. We're talking about you in the audience as well. So we must make sure that we have a gender lens through those funding mechanisms. And what we see is that there is gender mainstreaming, as we call it, is missing. But that also includes gender budgeting. We need to know how we're spending our money. Is our money actually meeting our values, our objectives, and our mission as the European Union? And absolutely, we need to have that inside. And we need massive investments also in multitude of services. There's not one model of care. We need to look at the formal, the informal, community-based, independent living, respite care, and above all, we need to ensure that there is the participation of those who are receivers and who are givers in the design of these services. We know it's not for the market only. We need to be able to design and decide ourselves what type of care services we need. Then fundamentally, we need to move from a male breadwinner model, because that is really at the core, the crutch, I would say, of the problems as well, insofar as a worker today is defined on the basis of a male life cycle. So 40, 45 years plus of an uninterrupted career actually gives you access to social rights and particularly pension rights. So we need to ensure that we move from an equal earner, equal carers model, so that both women and men can step in and out of caring roles at different stages of their lives without being punished. And therefore, we call for care credits for both women and men. And in time, if we can actually integrate a care model into our society and make it a driving force of our society, we can actually have another conversation about this. But for the moment, there is a massive gender pension gap, and primarily because women have stepped out of the labour market to look after different people in their lives. And the actual gender pension gap today is 40%, 40, which is absolutely massive, and comes back to what Maria was saying earlier on. It's about poverty. We're talking about the feminization of poverty as women age. That has to stop. And we need to make sure that the economy driven on the value of care is an economy that will make it equal for everybody. We need to value care, and it's been said many times. We need to make sure the pay and working conditions are up to high standards. We need to also make it attractive career options for men. And therefore, by doing so, we will also break the stereotypes that it's men, that it's women that are the carers, and that it's expected of them. So I think just to say that the pandemic gave us the opportunity to give us a glimpse of what a caring economy and a caring society could look like. But we now have to work together to make sure that we have a strong, solid care deal for Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. I thought with Tim setting the scene for take quotes, we might continue on with that, but I have to quickly switch before the closing remarks. But thank you very much, Mary. A lot of food for thought. I'm going to quickly hand over to Dr. Hans Dubois, as mentioned in the outset, Senior Research Manager in the Social Policies Unit at Eurofound, based in Dublin, Ireland. So Hans, I pass to you.
Thank you. Next slide, please. There are three key dimensions to care. Firstly, the care workforce, the formal care workforce, is largely female. Second, at least for long-term care and childcare, in all member states, a larger part of the care providers are informal carers, actually not formal carers. caring for family or friends or children, and most of them are also female. Then in long-term care, also the users are more often female because women have a higher life expectancy in all member states. So anything you do in this sector impacts women more than men. Next slide, please. So when you look at the care workforce as a whole and the development over the past decade, you see that it grew tremendously. So that's for healthcare the case, that's for childcare the case, but it's most so for long-term care the case, and that's what I focus on in this presentation. So the care workforce, long-term care workforce, has expanded by 1/3 in just 1 decade. At the same time, it has aged more rapidly than any other sector. So at the moment, 38% of long-term care workers are aged 50 and over, compared to 33% of all workers. A 10 percentage point increase, which is more than any other sector. Now, amidst this incredible change, there has been one very stable factor, and that's that precisely 81%. Okay, it depends how you measure it. We looked at it as a sector, and then you get 81%. If you only look at the care professions, then it's a bit higher, is female. And that was the same 1 decade ago, exactly the same. Now, looking at this formal long-term care workforce, at the working conditions challenges these mostly women face. First of all, indeed, pay in all member states is well below the national average pay. Actually, on average, is 21% lower than average pay. Only in 3 member states, the difference is less than 10%, which is still large. At the lowest paid within long-term care, assistant nurses, carers, and social carers. Now, there's little influence on, it's not only pay, there's other things. So there's little influence on working time, alternating shift and short notice work. Also, there's large emotional challenges, more exposure to adverse social behavior at work than in any other sector. And there are specific physical challenges, such as lifting or moving people, or working with infectious materials, but being less protected against them and informed about health and safety. Now, during the pandemic, more indicated that, or more care workers indicated that they wanted to leave the sector than before, and all these challenges increased. And in the graph, you see that all this has a negative impact on health and also on the likelihood for people to work beyond the age of 60. Next slide, please. Now, these working conditions need to be improved. Yes, to improve the situation of formal long-term care workers, but also to address increasing staff shortages. So you have countries which have basically no access to long-term care. They need to step up access to long-term care, many post-communist countries. Aging societies, so more needs. You have retiring workers, as we just saw, an aging workforce. Now, if you don't improve working conditions, then it has only limited potential to try to help people work or stimulate people to work beyond the pension age, for instance, or to ask people to work more hours, because actually 42% of long-term care workers works part-time. Now, and thirdly, it's important to improve working conditions because through this, it also has it improves access to quality long-term care. Now, how to do that? It's key to consult with social partners, but some areas for action, yes, of course, better pay, but also more attention for mental health challenges in this growing sector, more influence on the work arrangements, reduce administrative burdens, better access to childcare, actually, for instance, that could increase working hours for people who want to, but are involuntarily working part-time because of childcare arrangements. Then, of course, there's some role for technology, but in a recent report we saw that actually it's likely, well, it was not so much during COVID, while healthcare technology played a large role. Then, well, it's challenging amidst staff shortages and work pressure. It's other things that can help include training, so for instance with dealing with aggression or kinesthetics, and better staffing, of course. But then you get into this vicious circle that first you need to improve working conditions to have better staffing. Now let's focus briefly on a subsector of long-term care, formal care at home, which is key to the policy strategy, in European care strategy, for instance, of enabling longer lives at home. Now, home care comes with specific working conditions issues. So in long-term care, self-employment, platform work, it's not so common, undeclared work, but these are concentrated in home care. Also, the home is a rather hard environment to regulate and control. Training, technology, and better staffing can help. Now, formal care at home also is given by domestic carers. In some countries, specifically live-in care, where the care provider lives in with the care user, is really common. And this sector has often the worst employment and working conditions, and also with challenges for quality of care. And this sector has very high rates of women employed, also migrants, by the way. Now, there's risks in low-income member states with increasing incomes, and many post-communist countries, with bad access to long-term care, that this sector will increase in an unregulated way. So, for instance, Ukrainian refugees may end up in this unregulated sector. Now, you can regularize it, as Austria did, for instance. And yes, as the European Care Strategy highlights, the ILO Convention on Domestic Workers needs to be ratified, not only ratified, also implemented, actually. But if you provide access to good, flexible, high-quality home care and community-based care, then often living care is not necessary, as we see in many Nordic countries, for instance. Overall, there's a lot of public money involved in long-term care, so this leverage, this public leverage should be used more effectively for good working conditions. For instance, in public procurement for residential care, but also in terms of care allowances, that they are only to be used for declared care with registered providers. Informal care, 44 million people in the EU provide frequent informal long-term care to relatives or friends. Now, access to long-term care and childcare is essential, but cannot replace all informal care. So it's important to support informal carers also in other ways. Yes, many of these measures are actually focusing on employment. So, for instance, life balance measures. But many informal carers are actually not of working age. They also need to be supported for their health and mental well-being, for instance, with respite care. Now, some final points with regard to informal care. If not well-designed, measures, so for instance, care leave, actually have the big risk of solidifying existing genderized care patterns. The focus should really be on better access to formal long-term care as much as possible. With regard to formal care, there have been examples of incentives and campaigns to attract more men to this sector, but it has not worked so far. So for now, given the situation as it is now, you improve the situation for many people, for many women, by improving the working conditions in the sector. However, to truly address the issue, gender imbalances in care provision should be more structurally addressed by stimulating gender equality more generally in society. And when I'm reading my kids, I'm always a little annoyed that the care providing figures in the books I'm reading, it's always the mother. And it's a bit tricky because, yes, it's probably reflecting reality, but you won't change the situation if you keep repeating this to your children. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Hans Dubois. Thank you very much for that insight. I'm going to hand it over to our final panel speaker for this round before we open the floor to question and answers. So you're going to be given a 10-minute heads up here, everyone. So let me pass it to Dr. Robert Sweeney, Head of Policy at the think tank Action on Social Change Ireland, or commonly known as TASC.
Slide, please. So there was a lot of talk about different aspects of care, and basically what I want to discuss is why care work, paid care work, tends to be poorly paid. And I'll focus a little bit more on early years education and care, or childcare, as it's more commonly known as. So I'll look at the economics of care, the conditions of care workers in Europe, and look at some comparisons of Ireland and Denmark. Denmark is typically given as a paradigm, a good example of a childcare system, and Ireland, especially historically, is typically given as a bad example. Okay, so slide, please. So if we, for the moment, assume that we have childcare or care which is private, it's for profit, how might we increase wages? Well, there's a number of ways through which a firm would typically try to increase wages. One is that the firm might try to increase prices such that if wages are higher and prices are higher, it maintains its profit margins. So one way to absorb wage increases is through increasing prices. Now, this is much more difficult in the care sector, and particularly in the childcare sector. The reason being is that childcare is substitutable in the home. So if the cost of purchasing childcare increases enough, well, there will quickly become a point whereby it's just not economical for the family, typically for the mother, to work. So if you just increase the price of care in response to rising wages, well, then that care will shift to the home. So that puts a cap, it's one of the things that puts a cap on wages in the care and childcare sector in particular. There was quite a bit of talk about productivity, and I'll just elaborate on that just for a second. So what do we mean by productivity? Typically, an increase in productivity is whereby you make more output given the same amount of labor. That's typically how an economist would describe an increase in productivity. There's two ways to do that. One is basically speeding up the work. You squeeze the worker. And the other way is through automation, technology, etc. Neither of those are feasible when you're looking at care. So you can speed up some types of work, and technically that counts as increase in productivity, whatever you want to think about that, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But not with care, because the quality of care is dependent on how much time you actually spend on it. So, for instance, if you think of, say, a therapist, if you tell the therapist, increase productivity by speeding up, well, that's not really going to increase productivity, because the faster you go, you denigrate the quality of the actual care. So it's not possible to increase productivity by squeezing the worker, because it affects quality. So care is a little bit unusual in that respect. And the other way is to automate or use more technology. And if you look at most sectors of the economy, this is typically the basis of higher wages. So if you look at, say, manufacture of computers, the cost has fallen enormously, and that increases profit margins. The cost has fallen because of technological improvements. That increases profit margins, and therefore enables firms to pay higher wages. But again, that's not possible because care and childcare, long-term care as well, they're inherently face-to-face services. You can't automate them. So as long as you leave care to the for-profit sector, there's just these mechanisms which lead it to be poorly paid. Slide, please. Task in conjunction with FEPS, we did a study a couple of years ago looking at the conditions of care workers in Europe. It's difficult to get a standardized definition of care across countries. So I wouldn't draw your attention to the country differences, but just look at within each country, I compare various measures of precarity, involuntary part-time, variable working hours, temporary contracts, compare care workers to the rest, and that's the circles. And in the vast majority of European Union countries, care workers have more precarious jobs than the rest of the economy. Care workers more broadly defined than just earlier workers. Slide, please. Similarly, and Hans touched on this a little bit, there's various measures of job quality that you can kind of dive into here. I looked at how carers experience, the extent to which carers experience various types of physical strain. So do they believe their health and safety is at work because of their job? Are they experiencing adverse health impacts? Are they exhausted on a regular basis? And, you know, there'd be different reasons whether you're looking at childcare versus kind of elder care. Childcare might regularly get infectious diseases from the children. Elder care workers, you know, might have physical strains because they're lifting people and things like that. But the point is that I'm trying to draw your attention to is, again, what you see, care workers, they're subject to more adverse physical strains in most countries compared to the rest of the workforce. Slide, please. Now, you might be able to see this very well. I hope you can. So it's just looking at public spending on early childhood education and care, or more commonly known as childcare. So I mentioned that there's these market mechanisms such that if you leave care to for-profit providers, that it leads it to being poorly paid. So the way out of that is essentially through either the state directly providing the care or through state subsidies. So the extent to which the state spends on care is a very good predictor of the paying conditions in that sector. So no surprises there that the Nordic countries come out best or spend the most, shall we say, in terms of GDP. Iceland, and the comparator I'm going to use is Ireland. It's something like 4th or 5th from bottom. Now, Irish GDP figures are a bit fuzzy, but that's another day's work. But it doesn't spend as much as most countries on care, early years care at least. So slide, please. And this is ongoing work that I have. If you look at Denmark, often the best people in class, pedagogues, which are essentially preschool/kindergarten teachers, they earn between 70 and 96% the national average salary. 96% is more for managers, and they earn very similarly to what teachers earn. And and if you look at more general conditions, overtime, leave, working time, they're actually very good. And these are collectively bargained. They're not so much set by law, but they're bargained between employers and unions. There's a couple of historical reasons for that. Strong social democratic institutions. Basically, you had a number of disparate private providers up until the 1960s. And then in the 1960s, it was taken into the public sector, the childcare system. One of the reasons as well, strong social democratic institutions, is you had this idea of the pedagogical rights of children, and there was also labor shortages at that time. The educational philosopher Froebel was very influential. Interestingly, it wasn't until the 1970s that childcare and female labor force participation became strongly associated with gender equality. Slide, please. And you compare that to Ireland, if you just look at pay, it's only 50 to 65% of average. Now, it is improving. There is increasing investment in childcare in recent years. The historical reasons why it's poorly paid in Ireland is weak social democratic institutions. Ireland was a very Catholic country, but not only a Catholic country, it was a very repressive type of Catholicism. So there was a marriage bar up until the early 1970s, such that once women got married, they had to resign their public sector post if they were public sector workers, and that bled into the private sector as well. So you had very low female labour force participation in Ireland historically. It was the lowest in the European Union until the 1990s. So there wasn't much of a need for childcare. So those are the kind of historic cultural reasons, but in recent years, in significant extent due to concerns about gender equality, there has been increased investment, more from the perspective of labour force participation rather than working conditions per se, but there have been slow moves in the right direction. So slide, please. Just summing up, so care work left to market forces results in low pay and poor conditions. Significant variation in pay and conditions across European countries, largely predicted by the amount of public spending. Historical, social, economic factors have shaped care systems and pay, and historic cultural factors being a big factor there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, thank you very much to all our panelists. And as mentioned, Laeticia and Meena will step in after our Q&A. But can I first be a little bit unorthodox? I don't know about you, but we've been sitting well over 60 minutes at this point. So if we can get everybody just standing up to allow the blood to get through to one's brain and do whatever, not a great angle for screen, I apologise, but we can do whatever we need to do in order just to feel a bit like a human. I wish we only did this when we were voting. We'd actually get through a lot more. But thank you very, very much. And feel free to continue to stand if you wish. If you're protesting, that might be a different conversation, but that's also welcome too. I'm going to hand it over to you all. What I would ask though, obviously Slido's there, happy to take it from the floor. Can I be really, could you do me all a favour and just questions versus, and quite specific, and I ask that only so we can get as many questions from the floor as possible. And if you're quiet on the questions, I've no problem finding eyes that happen to make eye contact with me and putting some pressure on. So I'll open to the floor. If you have a specific person that you'd like to ask, please do so. Names are up here, so I'm happy to help suit too if you need to be. Did someone have their hand up here first, and then I'll come to yours? Mary, did you see? Oh, yes, perfect. The person at the back there, and then we'll go with yourself, and then yourself. Yeah. Could you do me a favour? We just give us your name so we know who we're addressing to. Thank you. And I'll take the three, and then we'll answer, and then I'll take another three.
Thank you so much for this very interesting panel. I'm Gaia Meijers with Women in Development Europe Plus. I would like to ask two questions. Firstly, I will kind of introduce them together. The EU is also really promoting an intersectional approach, which is really moving beyond binary conceptions of men and women, but really looking also of bringing that together with an anti-racist, anti-LGBTQI+, anti-colonial approach. So could you maybe, and I think some of the panelists were really going very deeply into the difference between men and women, but could you maybe go more deeply into the specificities of, for example, migrant women in Europe, given that they are in a very marginalized position and that they do really a lot of care work in Europe? So could you also bring in this anti-racist perspective? And secondly, when we look at the women in the global south, I think several panelists really talked about the COVID pandemic, for example, Mary Collins. And of course, this impacted women of different groups in Europe greatly, but also through our policies, we also impacted the women in the global south hugely, for example, by closing borders, and currently also by blocking the vaccines access at the WTO for women in the global south. So can that be something that you maybe also reflect on, what care can mean, what the Europe can mean for the women in the global south?
Thank you very much. Yeah, great question. Take yourself. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. Fascinating discussion and panel and full of really great information and analysis. And I just want to really pick up on the point made by Tim Jackson about why are we in the margins? In fact, it took me about half an hour to walk here from the main plenary room, right? So how do we get from the margins to the beating heart of the debate on beyond growth? I'm very often in discussions, particularly with sort of just transition, environmental organisations, and it's often quite a surprise for them when I bring the issues of feminist economics, the purple economy, the care economy up. So what do we need to do to get into the beating heart, apart from perhaps co-opting Taylor Swift into the debate? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I missed your first name.
Joanna Makeup.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And yourself, sir.
Alberto from the United Nations Development Programme. Perhaps related to the question that preceded me, macroeconomically, how do you see the scare economy idea plug into the post-growth, degrowth economy? Is it going to be some kind of care Keynesianism, some kind of care moonshot mission economy style? I mean, what is the architecture there?
Thank you very much. Great broad three. May I say, Joanna, just to pick up logistically, I just wanted to all flag because logistically it's important. So this side of the building has the biggest rooms. I can tell you this from Philip Lambert as MEP, as main coordinator, it's not to keep us on the fringes, it's just logistically this is the biggest room. And the reason we're here versus in plenary is because of who showed the most interest in a certain topic that elevated up to plenary. So just to flag, unless anybody else has a more deeper understanding of it, then please do, because I will write if needs be. I'm going to open up the floor to anybody in particular who wants to come in. Hans?
I can say something about the migrants. So in long-term care, more than in healthcare, there's a higher rate of foreigners working, but in particular non-EU migrants, usually because it's seen as an easy entry point because there's less requirements often in terms of formal diplomas. Now, and of particular concern is that these data usually exclude the most precarious sector of all within long-term care, and that's domestic care, where the employer is the care receiver or the family, and in particular live-in care, where the care provider lives in 24 hours with the care receiver. Now, in this group, in most countries, almost all of these care providers are migrants or EU mobile citizens as well. It differs a bit per country. So in Germany, you have a lot of people from Poland actually working in very precarious situations, living in with the care receiver. In in other countries, such as, for instance, Malta, Cyprus, it's more people from the Philippines, for instance. So it differs per country, and it also differs per country what their situation is. But overall, it's certainly one of the examples where there's an intersection between migrants, because they're migrant women, and they're in the most vulnerable situation, probably within the long-term care sector.
Thank you very much. Not to cut it, do you want, not next. Do you want to come in on any point?
I could come in on maybe the final. Yeah, I could come in on the final question asked by Alberto. The kind of macroeconomic implications of care. Well, one, if, as I tried to highlight it in my presentation, if you want to sort of improve the lot of paid care workers, it's difficult to do that without spending money. So there might be some taxation or debt implications of the care economy. However, there are, and people made reference to the fact that, you know, there are maybe greater multiplier effects when you spend money on care, because, you know, it's a face-to-face service, so you're not importing goods or services in order to do care work. But, you know, we shouldn't sort of kid ourselves at the same time that it's going to result in huge economic growth directly, because it does suffer from limited productivity improvements. But indirectly, it can, you know, spur on other economic activity, because if you increase female labor force participation, well, that increases the demand for all sorts of things, because if women are out working, there'll be greater demand for things like spending in restaurants, laundry services, all the types of activities that were previously performed in the home. If you invest in the care economy and increase labor force participation among women, that stimulates other sectors of the economy like that. So.
Thank you very, very much. Ipek, do you want to come in on anything?
Yes, just to follow up on the last question by Alberto from UNDP. I like the term care Keynesianism. I think that's exactly where this conversation comes in. The macro-micro simulations that I talked about in my presentation, which look at the economic outcomes, demand-side outcomes of investing in care, usually use a comparative framework. They compare it to the case of spending of a similar magnitude on another sector. And the most common one that we see in fiscal stimulus packages are usually physical infrastructure. And they show that the same magnitude of spending, public spending on care services versus construction sector, physical infrastructure, creates 3 times more employment and generates 3 times more earnings than the case of the same spending going to the construction sector. So the point that these studies are making from a Keynesian perspective is the following. It's not only the magnitude of fiscal spending, the magnitude of your fiscal stimulus package that matters, but also the composition of fiscal spending that matters in terms of you know, whether it's poverty decreasing results or employment inclusive growth, employment generating results versus, and also as I think Dr. Jackson pointed out, it was a great graph showing the emissions versus employment intensity of the different sectors. Also, the composition makes a difference in terms of sustainable, building sustainable a recovery for a sustainable economy and an inclusive economy.
Thank you very, very much. Conscious I might throw back out to the floor again. Are we all happy with that? Question from yourself, and then I have 2 from Slido. So we'll take this, these 3 for this round. Good team effort there. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Amelie Krug and I work for Ecolis, and I really liked your presentations, and I think it's really important to include the notion of care, that it's not just about paid work. Obviously, you're expanding paid work by focusing also on all kinds of economic activities that are not valued through the market. I feel like the notion of care that's discussed here on the panel is still a bit narrow, because it's not focusing so much on the ecological dimension of care, but more on the social dimension. So I would like to hear a bit more from you how that conception of care could also incorporate ecological values, the ones maybe Tim Jackson was referring to, the planetary crisis. How can we create a care economy that cares for people and the planet? And maybe you could also mention the concept of community-based initiatives, which you were also referring to, right? Volunteer work at the local level. That's also a form of care work. So what's the role of communities in caring for the planet, and how can they be supported through policies?
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Good question. I'm going to pick these two sliders up, and then, gentlemen, Sarah, I'll come to you. Okay, I'm just going to take, and I'll take you in the next round. And I shouldn't, apologies, I shouldn't be always assume people's orientation either, so correct me if I'm wrong. One question here is, can Mary tell us more about how care credits would work, and what would this mean to, say, parents of young children? That's from Lisa Howe Stewart, again via Slido, so hopefully you can see them on the screens. And the second from Anna is fewer working hours and therefore time for more unpaid care work a solution? And how would this be done without further gender inequality? So picking up from our first question in terms of ecological, Mary, you might take the care credits now, and then I'll open to the floor, and then I will come back to you.
Okay, thank you very much to all for those excellent questions. I think you've put a lot of things on the table that really need to be discussed. Can I just quickly say something maybe about the intersectional approach? You're absolutely right. When we say who cares, we say women, but we're behind women, there's a lot of different factors, a lot of different characteristics, age, nationality, social class, etc. And we need to be able to really and truly show who is actually doing the work at the end of the day. So I think that is work in progress. We don't have always enough data, but the more we talk about that, the more we demand for data, it will come. And it'll give us a much clearer picture of who we're talking about at the end of the day, and therefore much more capacities to actually address these issues from a global perspective. Just want to quickly then maybe, you were talking about the thing about the care deal. In our vision of a care deal, you pick everything. I mean, I had a slide that kind of showed you have to look at everything, including how do you finance it? So it does mean that you need to look at our social protection systems, how they're working, the role of taxation, how can we ensure that these are actually, the wheel is turning so that we can actually invest. And what is the return on investment? So it opens up for the people and the ecological issues too. It actually allows us to have the conversation. How do we bring, because we say we want the care deal is part of a care deal. It's on the same, it's a continuum, but it opens the conversation. How do we bring and ensure that we can embrace the environment, ecology in our caring values of society? But it's opening that conversation, and it's moving ahead. I mean, this is the first time we've actually had a political debate about care. Imagine, in 2023. So it's a slow process, but it's something that can actually take off, and it allows the conversation. And I think that's where we need to start, is to talk and to dialogue. And that's really the beginning. And I think the intergenerational approach as well, I think, is really important, because we see things differently across the generations, and projection towards the future as well, because it's not just about us today, it's about us tomorrow and about you tomorrow as well. So it's about really capturing that and really moving forward in that spirit. So the particular question about the care credits, so again, this is for pensions. And the reality today is that in most countries, if women step out of the labour market, it's like as if they've been doing nothing, basically, and they do not get recognised for the value of caring throughout their lives. And therefore they end up at the pension age, which is increasing more and more from 65 onwards. And they're missing, so-called missing periods in their lives because they weren't productive. They were doing nothing, basically. In the neoliberal spirit, they were doing nothing. So it's about really breaking that and saying that everybody has the right to step in, step out of the labour market without being sanctioned. So therefore, it's about acknowledging that time spent out caring actually counts. And therefore, you would get credits. Now, how they're calculated and all that, that's probably the next stage for further studies and etc. But making sure that it's valued, that it's captured and that it's valued. And also because it is very much part of the pension reform debates that are going on today. Because we are being told we need to shift into what we call the second pillar pension, which is insurance-based. So therefore the first pillar pension, which is state-based. So there are contradictions between them. Because an insurance-based pension scheme certainly doesn't recognise anything that you have done outside of the labour market, whereas the first pension state scheme can do it, and in some countries they do it. So it's about also ensuring that these issues are part of those debates on pension reform of today, which will impact on everybody tomorrow. And pensions, it's a long term because it's a generational. You start off on one scheme, the rules change along the way, and then at the end, you're in a situation where you realise that you haven't been taken into consideration. So it's about working out how much in terms of the value to ensure that we, at the end of the day, everybody has an income through the pensions at the end, I won't say the end of their lives, but the end of their professional lives, so that what they've done throughout their lives is valued, and that care is really valued within that. I hope I've answered. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Just picking up from Robert's point, we have a huge deficit in Ireland based off the marriage bar. Now we're celebrating our 50th year being in the European Union, and we have thousands of women who continue to work, we're looked at very differently by our government, sadly. Tim, do you want to come in? And sure. Ipek too, wave your hand if you want to come in too.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. So coming to this question about ecology and care, and it goes a little bit to the question of why we're at the margins. The care sector and nature suffer from the same structural dynamics, the same externalities, externalization process that externalizes and devalues nature, externalizes and devalues care. And of course, there's lots of things we could argue about in relation to the profound impacts that voluntary community work can have in delivering both care and care for planet. And I think that's really important work. What I think we can't lose sight of is actually we are staring down the barrel of a structural externalization of things that matter to life. And that externalization of things that matter to life is happening inside our economic system. It's happening for reasons which are promoted and justified and legitimized by the pursuit of growth. And I just wanted to pick up on a point that Mary made in her presentation, because she said, care is the missing sector of three sectors: care, digital, and green. Why is it that it's had so little attention? Because with the digital economy, you can expect some productivity growth. With the green economy, you can expect a lot of jobs in green construction. You can also, in some cases, expect some resource productivity growth. It's something that fits with the growth-based agenda. Care has always been placed as a second cousin to that. It has been devalued as a sector, as something that you can only afford if you've had enough productivity growth somewhere else to pay through the government or elsewhere for the care of people and things. And that structural dynamic sits right at the heart of capitalism. And so without addressing it, and Robert gave a very good overview of how that works in the market-based economy, without addressing the structural configuration of that, you don't get anywhere with either the green economy in its broader, wider sense of protecting the planet when there isn't a buck to be made out of it, or indeed in protecting care and the values of care. And so it seems to me, and that's why to me this session is so important, because if you can't solve it for care, then you're not going to solve it for those bits of the environment where you can't make a fast buck out of it. You're not going to work towards a post-growth economy if you're consistently obsessed with the idea of productivity growth as the only way of organizing society. And when we come back to that question of why we're squeezed into that marginal position, you look inside the structure of capitalism and you see those forces. And then you have to accept that actually what's going on is a value judgment about what value is on the output side of the productivity equation and who counts within that value side of the equation. And that's why, as everybody has pointed out systematically on this panel, you have to see care as something which is equivalent and symmetrical to the devaluation of women in society, and you have to see the structures as intrinsically patriarchal in that sense. So I don't know whether that explains, I'm not sure whether you can absolutely throw sexism at the Beyond Growth conference in putting us at the margin, but I think you have to place it front and center of an analysis of that question that you raised.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you.
Just in response to your question, if I understood correctly, also, yes, the care sector can be more greener. So I think it's also important to interact with these different perspectives. But for instance, with home care, there's examples where nurses cycle to the homes and are not refunded car use, for instance, or waste in hospital, huge pollution, so that can be reduced, over-medication. However, and that fits well with the Beyond Growth topic, I think, we all the time, we look at the care sector and assume it will grow, etc. But it's also important to think of how to prevent care needs. And there's actually many intersections with the green transition. So for instance, active modes of transport. They prevent obesity, care needs in the future, less consumption, good for the planet, good for less care use in the future. Insulated homes, good against energy overuse, and good against hospitalizations due to cold or heat. So there's a lot of interactions, I think.
Valuable point. I'm going to open the floor again. I know we have some questions coming in from Slido, but sir, I promised you.
I'm Jeff Peters from a Flemish think tank, Oikos. What I want to bring in is, I think, to try to bring in a fundamental point of view. Because I think when you look at labor, as labor is care, and as far as labor has to do with the meaning for people of what they do in their life. And then I come to the idea of Karl Polanyi of labor is a fictitious commodity. It is not a commodity. So as long as we organize labor in the broad sense through the idea of a labor market, we will always be in a problem. And also care labor will be more in a problem than labor in general. But it's a more general problem of how we organize labor and the connection of meaning of what we do with the meaning of our lives. And maybe I can have a comment of Tim Jackson.
Thank you very much. Ipek, there's a question in here on Slido, is care is not only highly gendered, but also highly racialized. How does the purple economy, care economy framework take this circumstance into consideration? I'll move on to this. Oh, perfect. We'll take a question from the floor and then we'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Thank you. Remco van der Pas, Center for Planetary Health Policy in Berlin. I have a general question. It's more about the commodification of care and the privatization vis-à-vis public sector. And healthcare is highly profitable, especially in relation to also its medicalization. Globally, the medical healthcare sector is one of the largest growing sectors that we see. So how can we prevent this commodification and care extractivism that we see?
Thank you very much. Ipek, do you mind me coming to you for thoughts and considerations, particularly on that question from Slido?
Yeah, yes, actually, I wanted to pick up on a question that disappeared from the screen on the fewer working hours. But let me first just say to the question about care work also being highly racialized. I think Mary already did answer in part to that question how the intersectionalities is a very important part of the story here. It's not only about women as a homogeneous category, but it's about it's a question of what types of women, women from where. So that's definitely an international care labor migration. I think is an important example of the intersectionality of the countries. On the fewer working hours as part of the solution, I think the demands for a shorter work week is in the labor market is definitely an important component of a gender equal care agenda. And this is one area, again, where the purple and the green economy demands overlap. There is some interesting survey data, time use survey data that was conducted under COVID lockdown and also in the late pandemic under partial normalization. And the data shows a substantial increase in men's participation in unpaid care, unpaid work time under the lockdown. And the analysis of the data finds that what lies at the source of increasing participation of men is in fact the trends in reduction of paid work hours and also commute hours by switching to remote work, home-based work. The data really speaks to the importance of the shorter working week and also the need for redesigning care leave policies together with options for home-based remote work, hybrid forms of work, and incentivizing these reconciliatory type of employment, not only for women, but also for men.
Thank you very much, Ipek. Anybody else want to come in? Tim?
Just quickly to respond to the point about commoditization, which is a really important one. It's a particular form of commoditization. Care is a responsibility of the state, it's a responsibility of government. So government underwrites with taxpayers' money the delivery of care, delivery of health and delivery of care. The structure of private delivery of that care is often what you could only call extractivist. It takes that money and it uses that money to underwrite a series of structures, some of which are about the pursuit of pharmaceutical IP, some of which are about property chains, some of which are about control over care itself. And quite often, if you look at the structures of the economy, those commoditized private care deliverers, as we have done in some of our work, what you find is that quite a lot of that money doesn't even come back into the economy. The companies are often structured with offshore accounts. And so the long-term costs of care are being borne by the taxpayer as those costs rise. And the privatized, commoditized structure of the delivery of care is systematically milking that provision in ways which are benefiting the shareholders of large and small corporations. Now that, you can forensically examine the data in relation to that. It's horrendously true. And once you come to that realization, I think you have to come back to the realization of the responsibility of government to ensure that it's not throwing taxpayers' money into the direction of offshore tax havens, but actually supporting communities, returning the benefits of those services back into the community, where necessary, publicly putting some of the ownership of those things much more in publicly owned or commonly owned forms of ownership. Preventing, through financial regulation, the ownership of privatized care companies, the offshore profits, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, and this does come back a little bit to that question of care Keynesianism, because I don't think it is simply care Keynesianism. I think it's asking for something different, something stronger, a stronger role for a government that actually sees itself as the provider of well-being in the economy and not simply the driver of a productive output-based economy.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, just on the question of commodification of healthcare in particular, I think there's a couple of factors at play. One is obviously that as society ages, there's growing demands on the state for various types of services, whether that's public pension spending and also healthcare spending. And as we age, our healthcare spending needs grow. And as we get very old, say 75 into the 80s in particular, your healthcare spending needs grow non-linearly or exponentially. And I think the temptation on the part of governments is to try to cut healthcare costs by outsourcing it to the private sector as a way of, removing the burden on the state, and also just potentially for ideological reasons. But I just think that needs to be resisted. There's no easy way around that. Another thing I would highlight, and Tim just touched on this a little bit, why are some of the pharmaceutical companies and healthcare providers so enormously profitable? Well, developing drugs is a complicated process, but the way that we sort of finance research is such a way that we essentially gift, to a certain extent, monopoly profits to pharmaceutical companies through intellectual property rights and patent protections. Now, I'm not saying that we don't need patent protections to encourage research, but there's good work done on this by Dean Baker and other progressive economists, and he shows that a lot of the patent protections are not very necessary, and that there's other ways of funding scientific research, including medical research, and potentially that could be just you pay companies, or including drug companies, to do research. The state already does a lot of the research, but often it's the pharmaceutical companies that benefit, and you saw that in particular with the COVID-19 vaccines. A lot of the spending on R&D for these vaccines was undertaken by the state. And how might we get around that? Well, we could have the state continue to do a lot of the basic R&D. It shouldn't all be bureaucratized, where the state does all of the R&D. But what you could do is you pay the companies to do research and development on the condition that they make their findings open source. And that would actually, be beneficial for society at whole, because it would actually spur a lot more scientific discovery rather than you have all these companies hiding their findings themselves. So that'd be one way around that.
Thank you very, very much. Forgive me, folks. This is the correct clock. If anybody's following this one like I have been for the last hour, the panic was real. It's well past 4:07, but I'm about 8 minutes over time as moderator, and I do not want to cut from Laeticia and Meena. If you are in a rush to go, I completely appreciate there's a door in the back, or please come down here if you are moving on. We have a little bit of a grace period, but if you could allow for both speakers to add their reactions and their thoughts. So I'm going to go to Laeticia Thissen, again, policy analyst on gender equality, Foundation for European Progressive Studies, or commonly known as FEPS. Laeticia.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And also thank you for caring to stay after this very long, inspiring and rich session, which Meena and myself have the immense challenge to now summarize and also reflect on what should be the next step, especially from a policy perspective. I think if you are sitting here, I have no doubt that all of you have something to do with care, whether you have direct care responsibilities or should it be because you had to take care of yourself, whether you apply it as a decision maker dealing with care statistics, also applying it to the way that you actually do leadership in your own environment.
So in all this context, I'm particularly delighted to be representing FEPS today, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, which is the leading progressive think tank at European Union level. And as such, of course, gender equality, care and sustainability are at the core of our activities and we could not do otherwise than consider them as true priorities. My name is Laeticia Thissen and I work as FEPS as the policy analyst on gender equality. So I think from today's discussion, what is very clear is that a credible future beyond growth is a feminist future. And so that is certainly one of the main messages here. There's nothing revolutionary, there is nothing new, and there's nothing so original about it, because this is a concept and an idea that was already developed back in the 80s and that started emerging thanks to the contribution of feminist economists such as Marlene Waring with the publication on If Women Counted. Nowadays, you might be more familiar with the work of Caroline Criado Perez and Invisible Women, who are actually doing nothing more than simply showing that the economy is gendered. And there's nothing new about claiming the fact that there is a need to apply a gender perspective on climate, on care, and on the economy in order to make growth a sustainable growth, a solid context. And so here the reality of climate justice and discriminatory gender practices can no longer be ignored. This is something that has been very well underlined by Tim Jackson in his intervention when underlining the need to use care as a true blueprint. And as such, today's Beyond Growth conference should have a clear message, and that is the economy, society, and environmental sustainability and justice must be profoundly feminist. That has been at the heart of the claims of Mariana Mazzucati, who claimed that economic discourses doesn't accurately value care economies, and that traditional measures such as GDP do not adequately capture economic activities. And so as such, women produce value for society, but also beyond care, and they provide a wider creative workforce. In fact, economic statistics should capture these activities, and therefore women do make a real difference in decision-making, but also in organizational dynamics, and so therefore diversity should be encouraged so that issues are examined from a gender perspective. And so here, policymakers should go beyond just regulating, but also conveying a clear idea on what type of society that they want and what is the purple economy that they want to establish for themselves and for society. And so therefore, women should not just be seen as a token representatives, but also as a way to increase visibility, also of bringing them from the margin to the center of politics in order to collect those relevant data that are so problematic in also eliminating the persisting gender inequalities, and also living up to the statement that not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And so we have seen, especially through the last crisis, a rise and an increase of social inequalities, which have been exacerbated. It started with the 2008 financial crisis, moving on with the pandemic, and now we are also in the midst of the energy and cost of living crisis. And the paradox in all this is that if we look at the Oxfam reports, is that on the opposite hand, we see that the top 10 richest men are concentrating the majority of the planet's wealth. And so here, again, also from an intersectional perspective, we see that women, but also ethnic minority and other underprivileged groups are facing the brunt of the crisis, and that they are the ones that are bearing the huge responsibilities in order to repair our broken worlds. And so now it is time to basically find new ways to address these inequalities. And so here I would like also to echo the words of Joanne Tronto, who not only provided a definition of care that is holistic and comprehensive, but also very well illustrated that we need caring democracies. Why do we need caring democracies? Because due to the rise of democratic deficits, people are more and more feeling disconnected from political concerns. And so by politicizing care, you actually touch right away and you put the finger on what is important to them. And so therefore the importance also to tackling not only the democratic deficit, but also the caring deficits, whereby we see that more and more people have their care needs that remain unmet.
what policy answers? The most obvious one, and that has been repeatedly underlined by the panelists, is the need for public investments. And so here the purple economy is precisely calling for that. We need massive funding. We need a care deal, as Mary Colling from the European Women's Lobby has been so well illustrating. We need public expenditures that on the one hand can reduce and lessen the care burden on women, and at the same time also produce new labor market opportunities to those that had already, that always faced a disadvantage on the labor market. In all this, we need to be aware of the structural barriers and disadvantages, which tend to be forgotten. Yes, women are more and more qualified, but this doesn't mean that the gender pay gap is disappearing. Yes, it is true that we see more and more the increase of formalization of care work, but this is also being taken over by migrant labor workforce. And so that comes back also to some of the questions and reactions that were made from the audience, where we see that there is a shift and the development of an international distribution of reproductive labor that is shifting from from Western countries to also to being externalized to, again, the less privileged parts of society. And so that is why also I would encourage you to look at the FEPS primer on gender equality, because here the author Agnès Hubert is calling for a new model of growth. And here she's building on contemporary feminist economists who call for an economy that is focused on new mechanisms that not just build on traditional ways of accounting for the economy, but that focus on an economy of well-being. And so here the concepts should include indicators based on health, a recurring element that came back in the discussions, but also education, income, employment, and social situation. And so here the success should not only depend on growth, but also on people's state of well-being and happiness. The COVID-19 crisis should be a wake-up call. And so therefore the choice of data that we use in order to measure the state of well-being of a society truly matters. We need concrete and ambitious strategies in order to ensure socioeconomic well-being. And so here Agnès Hubert again is calling for the development of new models of growth based on alternative indicators. For instance, she's suggesting that the Commission could apply, instead of only GDP, gross social development indicators or gross environmental indicators for progress, in order to, for instance, guide the new EU initiatives, like, for instance, the Next Generation EU funds or the European semester. And here I would like to briefly show you a slide. I'm not going to delve longer into it, but this is just a very concrete illustration of work that we have been conducting at FEPS, and you can also look up the detail on FEPS' website. Here, concretely speaking, we were interested in how member states have used the opportunity of the Next Generation EU Fund to invest in the care sector and to apply the principles of a purple economy in their reconstruction. And what you can see here is illustrated in red and blue are those measures that are specifically considered either as care relevant or as care targeted. And so what jumps immediately to the eye is that within those measures that are foreseen in those 8 national recovery and resilience plans, is that regardless all the calls and regardless of all the discussions that we have had so far that we need to prioritize digital economy and the care sector, it remains it is still lacking in terms of prioritization. So that was simply also to illustrate the point, and I'm going to close my points here with 5 key elements, and I think this is perhaps essential in order to better value the place of care in society, is to apply the 5R ILO framework, which consists of recognizing care, reducing care, because we should not be taking it for granted, redistributing care in order to also lessen the responsibility on women, but also eradicate stereotypes, better reward care, and also better represent care workers through collective bargaining. And so I'm going to close here with the definition of Toronto that was mentioned earlier, but I think is truly significant in the context of the Beyond Growth Conference, that defines care as an activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't know whether we should give a round of applause for the amount of great content she covered or the fact she didn't breathe for the last 8.5 minutes to try and get through that all. But the power of the woman is where I'm going to leave that. Dr. Meena Fernandes, I'm going to hand to you, policy analyst in the European Added Value Unit of the European Parliament Research Service. So, Meena, I'll hand to you.
Thank you, Maria. And I'd like to start by saying thanks to you and your staff for the great organization of this panel, and also the audience for the great questions. I agree with Mary that this is a fantastic start, really, of a dialogue and discussion that is only going to keep growing. So thank you very much. I come from the Research Service from the Parliament, and our mission is to support the members and the committees with independent, objective, and authoritative analysis and research on policy issues that they are working on. And in this context, we produced a briefing on care work that accompanied the resolution that Maria mentioned at the beginning, the Common European Action on Care that was voted on last July. Now, I will add a few points just to try to connect the dots. A lot has been discussed, so I'll try to bring it up a level and leave you with some general ideas going forward. So we've talked a lot today about different aspects. We've heard a lot about data, and also a conceptual framework for understanding what is care work, what are the problems, who are the workers, what do they suffer. And there's a lot of data here. It's really quite impressive. So we are really well documenting the problem. We see the problem. It's evident. So that's one thing. The second is there are lots of possible solutions. We talked about improving working conditions. We talked about attracting more workers to the sector. Someone in the audience mentioned attracting more men to the sector. This was also quite interesting. And so there's different measures that can be organized around this 5 R's framework that Laeticia mentioned, but we have a lot of ideas on the solutions. And we also know that going forward, the sector is only going to become more important. We know that the needs for care are going to grow with an aging population. So I come again. What is the problem here? We know the problem, we know the solutions. Why is this not happening? Yes? And so some might say it's political will. Well, since I'm in the European Parliament and I see what the members are doing, I can tell you the European care, the Action on Care, it is very ambitious. It is calling for very ambitious action. It's calling for investment, as Laeticia mentioned, which is very much needed. And it is cutting across all political groups because it was adopted in the plenary. So the European Parliament has adopted this resolution. And so there's also been a lot of calls from civil society, from citizens, and so forth. So what is the problem? And I think this was well summarized with Tim Jackson's intervention, that it's not just about care, it's about another model of society, yes? And where care is at the center and at the heart. And so it's about shifting from wealth to health, without thinking about more, we think more about balance. And so it's about a broader shift. Now, I'm a researcher, and so I also see what can we be doing as researchers to do better. And I think for research, we can't just be identifying problems and solutions. We also need to compare what is the current situation versus what could exist. And that's what we try to do in our briefing on care work. And yes, for this, we need data, which we have, and we need new ways of analysis because we need to bring the data in interesting ways, and we also have to be a bit creative. And even if the data is not perfect, even if the analysis is not perfect, we still need to do something. It's urgent. So, and especially if we're serious about a viable path, an alternative path, we need to do it because otherwise the status quo is going to win. Policymakers need not only the solution, but also the ammunition to back it up. And so research can also be supporting this. Now, we explored this in a recent study. Could you switch the slide for me, please? Thanks, Barry. Just to take a step back from care work, in my unit, we did a mapping of the cost of non-Europe in 50 different policy areas. And so we looked at the benefits of further EU action in these different areas. The red square, well, not the red, the more pink one in the middle is about gender equality. And care is a big part of this. Yes, and this in relation, we have single market, digital transformation, green transformation. And care is very much at the center of this. And another part of our analysis, a very interesting finding, is that we can see social impacts moving along economic impacts. So by fulfilling gender equality, we can have economic gains. It is possible to have this sweet spot, which was mentioned earlier. So going back to this briefing, which I mentioned earlier, I did this work with Cecilia Navarra, who's in the back of the audience here. And we looked both at paid and unpaid care. And we looked at the cost of the status quo. What is this costing us, the current situation? And we looked at the potential gains of moving to a different reality, where care work is more balanced within the households and the sector is more modern, meaning that the working standards are better, and also it's able to attract more workers to meet the unmet needs, because the unmet needs are very high currently. Overall, we estimate that there's about potential gains of 114 billion, at least actually. We have a range of 114 billion to 200 billion euros each year. And one might say this figure is not correct, nor complete. We tried to do our best approach, and we also have this range. But just this figure alone tells us two things. First of all, it's not small. It's very big. 114 billion is about how much the EU has spent on digital in the next generation EU. So this is big. And the second thing is that if we could be gaining this each year, how come we're not doing it? How can we justify our inaction? Another way to put it is that by not acting on care, we are losing 114 billion euros each year. And this is a loss that we have heard about today. It's the poor working conditions. It is a low participation of women in the labor market. It's a psychological burden that are faced by more vulnerable people in society, including migrants who make up half of our society. So to conclude, we have a vision, or a lot of it has been discussed about a vision today. And to make it, the question is about making it a reality. And what's being called for is a change in direction. And we would argue, based on our research, oh, and I forgot to show this slide. So this one shows our theoretical, our conceptual framework for how we got to the results, our quantitative findings. But there is possible to have this sweet spot. There is this possible of interlinkages. And the more the interlinkages, we need to stop thinking in a silo of social impacts, environmental impacts, and fundamental rights, and economic impacts. All these things can move together, and they should, so that we can have a more sustainable economy that is also more resilient to crisis in the future. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you give another big round of applause to all our speakers, Ipek, Tim, Mary, Hans, Robert, Laeticia, and Meena. Thank you very, very much. May I just say, I hope it's giving you a lot of food for thought. I know certainly it is anybody who wants to watch this panel back or wants to follow up with the speakers, you can get all the info on the website. Or I know my team has posted on YouTube. If you just search my name, Maria Walsh, you'll also get directed here. Just to make sure, if you know of anybody at home who's looking for more of this information, that we're sharing that. I think that's important about the care. Can you give another big round of applause to the staff of the European Parliament, the IT team here behind us, the accreditation team that welcomed you in, and our European Parliament would not work if we didn't have translators. So we might give them a big round of applause. So thank you very, very much. Philip Lambert, MEP, and his team, a big kudos to him for designing this. He mentioned in the plenary earlier, he ran this a couple of years ago, and I'm really, really grateful he extended out the warm welcome to the European People's Party group, where I sit along with two of my other colleagues who are part of this. So I just want to acknowledge him in my final words. Let me thank my team also, Taneve and Oisin, but in particular Barry. He was name-checked up here. He's done incredible work at making this all happen. So can you be really, really caring and give him a big round of applause? Final 2 points. I just want to thank you all for showing up. Noted that next year's Beyond Growth conference needs to be held, specifically on care, needs to be held in the hemicycle. I will go back to Philip on that one. But it's really, really important next year when this does happen, and it will, that we get 1 or 2 extra people with us to fill out the space. So ultimately that the work doesn't stop here, as both Laeticia and Meena shared in terms of next steps, and all our speakers, we do have a hell of a lot more work to do on this, not just policy policymakers, but certainly all makers within the purple and care economy. Let me just finally say the Beyond Growth Conference runs until Wednesday, as you very well know, and I hope you do attend the other sessions. I'm sure you're probably running back to meet them. But finally, let me acknowledge local and European elections are on next year, folks. We're about a year's away. This is my pitch, not looking for certain political allegiances, but this is my pitch to you all. If your local representative, local, national or European, is not speaking about care, let's make something happen about that. It's incredibly important that who we replace in here or who we elect, both in here and in any of the institutions at local, national, European level, is fundamentally talking about care and working towards that. With that, in Irish, I say thank you very much, Gurmila Mahagith. Enjoy the rest of the conference and thanks for your time.